Hello, good afternoon, and welcome to the 11th edition of DOC NYC and our first ever online festival. Today is the final day of our festival, and we hope you have all been enjoying lots of great movies. I'm Opal Hope Bennett, shorts programmer and director of filmmaker development at DOC NYC, and it's my pleasure to lead today's DOC NYC Live conversation for Cecilia Aldarondo's film Landfall, which just won the Grand Jury Prize in the Viewfinders competition. Before we get started, a quick reminder that all DOC NYC films can be viewed online across the entire United States and all of its territories. The official festival wraps tomorrow night, but great news. Today we've announced that there will be a 10-day encore period that will include approximately 70 films. Now on to today's conversation. If you have a question for our guests, please type them into the Facebook comments section. And I invite you to share this video with your friends so more folks can watch live with us. Without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce today's guests, filmmaker and 2020 DOC NYC Grand Jury Prize winner, Cecilia Aldarondo, and the formidable Naomi Klein. Welcome, ladies. I want to take a moment here to give Naomi a proper introduction. Naomi Klein is an award-winning journalist, columnist, and the author of New York Times international bestsellers, No Logo, The Shock Doctrine, This Changes Everything, No Is Not Enough, and On Fire. Senior correspondent for The Intercept and contributor for Nation and Guardian, Klein is the inaugural Gloria Stein Endowed Chair in Media, Culture, and Feminist Studies at Rutgers University. She is also the co-founder of the climate justice organization, The Leap. And for the purposes of this conversation, we'll be engaging with her work on disaster capitalism, which she addresses in her book on Post-Maria Puerto Rico, The Battle for Paradise. Welcome, Naomi. Welcome, Cecilia.
Hi.
Hi.
Hi. Wonderful
Glad
to be with both of you.
A little nervous. But with your win yesterday, I'm like, this is the hot live. I'm so excited. Congratulations. Very well deserved.
Thank you. Yeah, I have all the energy for this conversation today after yesterday. I'm just kind of, I'm still glowing.
You and me both. I'm such a fan of your work. And here you apply your considerable creative hand to such an important issue. And, I just want us to dive on in. So in Landfall, you depict that Hurricane Maria wasn't just a natural disaster. Talk to us about what connections we can draw between climate change and other issues like debt and colonialism.
Sure. Well, I mean, I think the first thing is that we use the word natural to talk about environmental disasters that are, as we know, aided by us. So first of all, we should stop using the phrase natural disaster to talk about climate change. So, but that aside, one of the things that I saw happening in Puerto Rico, and part of the reason I made the film, was that you can see in a place like Puerto Rico, the way that certain pre-existing conditions only get exacerbated when something like a Category 5 hurricane comes. So in the case of Puerto Rico, and part of what the world really hasn't paid enough attention to, is that there was a series of economic policies that had left Puerto Rico in a really crippled state, namely a $72 billion illegal debt. And so this is something that Naomi knows a lot about, the way in which disasters like a hurricane become these opportunities for, governments, corporations, individuals with a certain kind of agenda to kind of swoop in. And in a place like Puerto Rico, which is the oldest current U.S. colony in the world, it becomes part and parcel of a 500-year-long colonial project. So there's a lot more than just kind of what the headlines covered, in 2017 when the hurricane hit.
Right, indeed. And Naomi, you weigh in?
Yeah, I first of all, I'm thrilled to be here with both of you, and huge congratulations to Cecilia for this film, which I think is coming at a really powerful moment. And rewatching it ahead of this conversation, I was really struck by the fact that I think a lot of people who maybe hadn't paid enough attention to what was going on in Puerto Rico will be able to relate to the process that Cecilia was just describing of a disaster acting as so many Puerto Ricans often tell us, an unveiling, right? A ripping away of all disguises for all of the other disasters that were being hidden from view or were being deliberately ignored. It became impossible to ignore them, including the systematic ranking of human life that makes the neglect, um, or what Ruth Wilson Gilmore describes as organized abandonment, possible.
Mm.
Um, and so, I often say, um, disasters aren't equalizers, as we often hear. In fact, what they are exacerbators. So whatever was terrible before the disaster becomes unbearable during it. Whoever was treated as as disposable before the disaster becomes sacrificial during it. And so um, that was certainly true in Puerto Rico and still is. Um, and it's true everywhere, frankly. It's true everywhere. I mean, climate change itself reflects that ranking of human life, because if we valued everybody equally,
Hmm.
then we would have acted decades ago,
Right.
because it was the narrative that, oh well, it's just Pacific Island states, it's just people close to the equator, it's just Southern Africa, right? And so, I mean, there was a calculus that is embedded in all of the UN decisions that say, okay, well, we'll let temperatures increase by 2 degrees Celsius. That's when it gets
Yes.
dangerous. And it's like, when that target was set at the UN, I was there in Copenhagen, and the African delegates left the meetings en masse and marched through the hallways of the UN conference center and said, this is genocide.
Mhm.
Hmm.
Yeah. Yeah. And I have,
Yeah.
sorry, go ahead, Opal.
No, no, it just reminded me of a documentary that I saw, with the island nation, who resolved that kind of a posture was, tantamount to an act of war. And you saying that, Naomi, reminded me of that moment where I was like, well, yeah, that's true. It's saying that, your you collective who are sitting comfortably have determined that we and our lives and our land are expendable.
Mhm.
Yeah. Sorry. Go ahead, Cecilia.
No, I was just going to comment that, part of this reminds me of something that somebody in the film said. Actually, there's several moments that are resonating. It's a very human-centric film. It's really trying to spend time with crisis experts who are, people living everyday lives in Puerto Rico. And there's a moment of there's a scene at a dinner party where my dear friend now Lucho says something like, I'm starting to believe that there's a plan to get rid of us. And there's a sense, I think, part of the way that these shocks actually manifest in our psyches and our emotional landscape, and that's part of what we're trying to capture here, is like, what is the emotional landscape of living in these times? Is that sort of sense of paranoia? Like, it's kind of crazy. Are they really trying to get rid of us? And that is what it's sort of insane to think that an entire population of Puerto Ricans are being sort of forcibly displaced in order to make way
Yes.
for a massive project of, until Puerto Rico is gone, turn it into a kind of tourist paradise. And that's, what is currently happening in Puerto Rico.
Yeah, no, I loved how you shot that sequence in the luxury space. It looked quite ominous, actually. I was like, I see what you did there, Cecilia. So you're talking about, this emotional landscape. Speak to how, landfall changes the way we can talk about communities who are hardest hit by Maria.
Yeah, I mean, I think part of the thing that I was feeling from the very beginning of experiencing the hurricane as a diasporic Puerto Rican who grew up outside of Puerto Rico, I had the experience, like many millions of diasporic Puerto Ricans, of seeing on the one hand, not knowing where our families were, not being able to get a hold of people, having this kind of communication blackout. And then on the other hand, seeing this kind of, bombardment of almost pornographic images of disaster. It's like a ticker tape, I think, that the media points at. You saw this after Katrina. You see this with wildfires. It's like the sad stories, it's the down trees, it's the floods, it's lines of people waiting for aid. And these images, I think, can be incredibly toxic in the way that they shape narratives about people who are experiencing these things day to day. And part of what was not being talked about nearly enough, I mean, this is one of the things that Naomi charts in her book, is all of the incredible projects that people, like grassroots community-led initiatives that literally were saving lives, were actually at the forefront. I mean, I was on a panel yesterday where we were talking about the way in which, the part of the major danger of that kind of optic is that it further buries people who are themselves actually doing the thing. They're actually proposing the right solutions. They actually understand better than anyone what their communities need. And the story that you see out of a place of Puerto Rico is an incredibly optimistic and actually quite beautiful story of community-led initiatives and solutions. And so that's part of what we really sought to highlight in the film, is people who are, for example, in this abandoned school, this project Mutual Aid, Bartolo, which is, a group of displaced people coming together and taking over an abandoned school, which, by the way, was closed because of some of these policies that we're seeing in Puerto Rico, taking over and creating a community-led holistic project that's giving people the dignity and the rights that they actually are being denied. So there's just so much that gets left out when we're not actually when we're victimizing people that are experiencing these things. And so that's a major goal of the project.
I mean, the other thing I would just add is that it's also a process of re-victimization, right? When people are treated as spectators and only just kind of passive recipients of aid, right? I mean, when you watch the sequence, right, of people, planting gardens and taking care of their neighbors, that is part of healing from a massive trauma. And, when people describe what it was like to be living through the disaster. And this is true, frankly, unfortunately, of so many disasters, right? You hear these stories of total loss of control. Parents describe, like, I couldn't even protect my kids, and just being up against these forces that are so much more powerful than us, right? I mean, anybody who's felt the force of a Category 3, let alone 5 hurricane, you're up against something so powerful. And when I was in Puerto Rico, I was and visited, some similar communities. I was so struck by how this, we hear all these buzzwords like, we need to heal the nation. We need to do, what does healing actually mean, right? And healing is empowerment. Healing is remembering that we can actually trust the natural world, right? As opposed to be constantly bracing against it. So, these community gardens, these mutual aid projects, it's not just that it's disaster response, it's also real emotional trauma recovery. I mean, the other thing I was just struck by listening to Cecilia is I think such an important message of the film is, what does it mean to engage in disaster preparedness, right? Because we're all thinking about this, and we are living in an age of serial shocks. And I think within capitalism, we think disaster preparedness is hoarding. It's like, get my toilet paper, get the wipes, get the generator, get the water, do all that.
Build my bunker.
Build my bunker. And and in the film you have the writ large version of that, which is the gated community. But the truth of it is, and this is what you show, I think, really beautifully on screen, is that true disaster preparedness is relationships, community, knowing where your neighbors are, knowing where your elders are, and having those networks. So yeah, I thought that was so important in the film.
Yeah.
So we've got some questions. I'd love to get to you both. One was wondering, as the news cycle turns, do you feel there's Puerto Rico fatigue as news and chaos never stops? Also, what happens with the crypto evangelist pirates who were selling a vision the Boricas were not subscribing to?
Yeah. Well, the first thing I will say is, how can you have Puerto Rico fatigue when Puerto Rico consistently fades into the background? I don't think we heard from Puerto Rico nearly enough. And I think that's part of what I'm talking about is there is so much to be learned from Puerto Rico, so much to celebrate, so much. Let's talk about the fact that in 12 days of historic protests, people in Puerto Rico, in the most creative protests I have ever seen, managed to take to the streets and get rid of a democratically elected governor. Like, we could take a page from that book.
Yes, that's right.
So I know I don't think there's Puerto Rico fatigue, not at all. In fact, COVID has only sort of forced Puerto Rico to fade more into the background. So I'm certainly not tired of my homeland, and I hope that people watch the film and also recognize that, you know, I mean, maybe we're all tired. I think we could talk about like crisis fatigue and
Crisis fatigue, exactly.
But I think that there's also something in the film that's like what Naomi's talking about, is that these incredible possibilities of community building, of pleasure, of finding how important it is to find your people and find ways to take rest and to care for one another, and frankly to not always be focusing on the devil in whatever house, and et cetera, et cetera. So, but also to answer the other question, I want to say, you know, we took great pains to not let those kind of clown-like cryptocurrency figures to take over our film. They hog a lot of media attention, and this is what I think clown-like problematic figures do. And so, but I will say, and in a lot of ways, they're sometimes these are true charlatans, like smoke and mirrors. Like, they come in places like Puerto Rico and make a big show of something, and then they don't really have teeth. But I can say, for example, Brock Pierce, who's the kind of, you know, the leader of the band of merry men from, you know, sort of straight out of Burning Man that ended up in Puerto Rico. You know, he's still very much promoting his agenda of basically, you know, no taxes and you know, and sort of this snake oil of saying that, oh, with this sort of tech revolution that's actually highly individualistic, highly profit oriented, really secretive, lots of like nefarious things, he's still there, and he's still promoting his ideology, and he just ran for president. Like, granted,
Of course he did.
yeah, I mean, I can tell you, he was on my ballot in New York State. Like, nobody was talking about him because they were focusing on other things. But if the fact that he had the money and the resources to run a presidential campaign all the way through to the election tells you that this is somebody, and in a place like Puerto Rico, he continues to peddle whatever influence he can. So until he's truly out of there, you know, he's definitely still playing a role. But I think at the same time, I don't want to spend all my time and energy focusing on these kinds of figures, because the true story of Puerto Rico is far more important.
Yeah.
I think they're interesting. Just really quick, like, I think they're interesting as a kind of narrative technique, in the sense that they so perfectly embody this idea of freedom from all responsibility, you know, and like, just to bring it to COVID, you know, I think we are seeing so much of that, like, you know, don't tell me to wear a mask, don't tell me to think about anyone else. And their idea of what freedom is, or what paradise is like, we don't have to pay taxes, we don't have to give anything back, we are just building our own, you know, gated world, right? And so as we think about what is paradise, what is real freedom, they're a useful foil, you know. And I think they play that role really well in the film.
Indeed, indeed. Another question, could you talk about the title Landfall and how it came about? Also, how you framed the story that ties together so many interconnected issues.
Yeah, I can say, you know, sometimes titles come quickly. This was one that we had about 5 million of them, and some of the people who worked on the film can tell you about that. There were some really ridiculous ones that were thrown around. That this film did not want to be titled. But there was one title that reminds me of this kind of crypto ideology that we had floating around at one point. At one of these conferences that I was at, there was a young woman who had just arrived in Puerto Rico from Silicon Valley, and she was talking about what she saw as the sort of liberatory potential in a place like Puerto Rico. And she said, Puerto Rico, it's the blueprint for the new earth. And it was such a telling phrase. Like we were thinking about calling the film Blueprint for the New Earth. And I always had that in my mind because it's so, on the one hand, like, and you hear on both sides of the spectrum, people saying like, yeah, there's actually an opportunity in this really awful moment to figure out what kind of world we really want and to build that new world. But that comes from all sides. And the fact that she's looking at this place as a kind of tabula rasa, like, how much more colonialist can you get? Like, I want to build my big house of dreams. But it's also, you know, it talks about how Puerto Rico is paradigmatic. It is this, like, if you study it, you can see so many complicated issues that become hard for us to kind of pin down, all coming to roost in this one place.
But why Landfall?
Oh, right. Yeah.
Thanks, Naomi.
So it was a lot of things. We were, you know, I like titles that do work on multiple levels. And I think for me, Landfall is a title that, you know, on the one hand, you have the literal meaning of like what happens when a storm arrives on a shore, right? It makes landfall, and it has its moment of potency. But it also, I was thinking a lot about what it means for a world torn asunder, right? The sense of collapse when this place is literally kind of coming undone. And, you know, one of the main ideas for the film is to say, you know, when the world falls apart, who do we become? What becomes possible in all senses, in the hard sense of that, in the beautiful sense of that. So yeah, it's really meant to kind of connote, you know, this moment. Maria was a sort of sea change moment, but a really complex one, and it's not just about sort of the tragedy of the hurricane.
So that perfectly dovetails to my next question. What lessons does Puerto Rico have for the world at this moment? I'll ask you, Naomi, first, and I know you have one ready at the tip of your tongue, Cecilia.
Well, you know, I think what I said earlier about, you know, disaster preparedness is relationship building. And you know, one of the things I learned in my time there had to do with broadening our definition of sovereignty to include water sovereignty, food sovereignty, energy sovereignty, which is something that can't be built in a bunker. It's something that can only be built in relationship and in community. You know, I think Puerto Rico teaches us to adopt the posture of the student with relation to disasters. And I feel like COVID is that, you know, we should, instead of waging war on the virus, we should say, what is this teaching us? What is being unveiled here?
Yeah, just to build off of that, I think, you know, one of the things that we're seeing right now coming home to roost in countries like the United States is a wholesale kind of colossal failure of institutions that we are conditioned to expect to care for us, look after us, save us. And I think part of what, you know, for better or for worse, we're seeing is a moment in which and this is, I think, goes beyond the Puerto Rican case, but is seen in the Puerto Rican case, but you see it in places like, you know, places like New Orleans post-Katrina as well. You see it in Detroit, you see it in places where, you know, and just communities that have known this for a long time. There's a phrase in Puerto Rico, nos tenemos, we have each other. Like this idea that solidarity, that sense of, as Naomi's saying, like an anti-individualist stance, the sense that the only solutions have to be communal ones. And also going beyond our sense of community, like sometimes our sense of community can be incredibly insular, incredibly classist, incredibly racist, right? What does it mean to have it be us, right? And I think we also have to move beyond these incredibly actually potentially violent forms of exclusion that are like, oh yeah, my community means this people. And so what we are seeing right now, I think in Puerto Rico, you saw it in the protests, this incredible moment of people from all walks of life, from all different backgrounds, often people who, racialized, queer, the most marginalized people coming to the forefront
Yeah.
and sort of showing people how it's done. And so yeah, I think that there's an incredible, we're not talking enough about what can be beautiful about sort of when people in power relinquish some of that power, and when we actually work together to dismantle the hoarding of resources and all of these things, beautiful things become possible as well.
Yeah, no question. The working together lesson is a big one. And COVID is showing that we have a lot of work and growth to do there. Audience question, and we've got our 5-minute warning. Audience question: what is your preferred name in Spanish for the film?
Well, so this is hard. We're calling it Landfall
Mm.
in Puerto Rico as well, and because we've been kicking around two words. One is tormenta, and the other one is temporal. And temporal, actually, there's a song that is in the end credits of the film called Temporal. It's an old plena, which is a folkloric song form, which means storm, but it also means time. And there's a deep sense of the complexities of time in the film. But yeah, so we really have thought. I think we sort of called it temporal, but there's something about the way that landfall, it's not quite translatable. So anyway, we're calling it Landfall, and I, with my deepest apologies, because language justice is real, and I don't want to be voicing English words on a Puerto Rico, which has English thrust upon it all the time, but it is what it is.
That's fair. That's fair. I am. Let's see. I think we've got just a minute. I was really glad to have the audience interact with us, because I haven't had it in the last few lives, and I really feel like this is a appreciated issue that you've discussed here in the film. I'm curious about the subjects. Have you shown them the film? What has been their feedback?
Yeah, so I made the film in collaboration with Lale Nemro Pastor, who's an activist and DJ who's based in Puerto Rico, and whose voice actually ended up kind of carrying the film. We didn't plan for Lale to be in the film, but Lale's truth is too powerful. And unfortunately, Lale can't be here because Lale's doing a Q&A for us in Amsterdam at IDFA right now. But in collaboration with Lale, we shared the film before we finished. I went back to Puerto Rico, and we organized the screening for as many people as we could. And yeah, it's really, I think one of the things I wanted to note is that this is a film, Naomi was talking earlier about trauma. We really worked hard to make sure that this was a film that works on different levels depending on people's connection to Puerto Rico. And one of the things I want to note is that we really tried to make a film to hold space for trauma, for what is unprocessed. And if anyone who's Puerto Rican is watching this hasn't seen the film, I feel like we should put a trigger warning on the film, because people have said that it's really painful and often difficult to watch this film, because the memories from Maria, and this is part of the project of the film, is to sort of try and gently encourage us to not forget what happened, because part of the political project that is against Puerto Rico right now is to sort of try and get people to move on and not think about it. And there's so much that's unresolved from the hurricane. So, but it was one of the things that happened where we saw very intensely, it's a different thing when people, not just that are in the film, but who were in the hurricane, who reality, it's a really different experience. And we're really working, as we make our plans to take the film to Puerto Rico, to shape the experience of seeing the film carefully, because it's definitely it's an intense watch. It's not an easy experience, but it's also meant to be an occasion for people to heal.
Last two questions. What is the future release plan? More people need to see this. And have you seen a difference in reaction to film from Spanish speaking versus English speaking audiences?
Yeah, so I guess I'll answer the second part because it was sort of related to what I was just saying.
Mhm.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, and this is also because of the, the dearth of representation in popular media around just Latinx people generally, Spanish-speaking people, people from marginalized communities. I think there's always this kind of feeling of like, finally, a film for us. Just as, even if people who are Puerto Rican, it's just like, this sense that, we're really trying to center the experience of people who are not always centered or rarely centered. So I would say yes, the answer is yes, different experience. But I think it's also, again, this paradigmatic film that I encourage, even if you have no ties to Puerto Rico or you think it has no lessons for you, I promise you it does. And then the first question was our release plan. Yeah, so we're continuing to do these virtual festivals. Like I said, we're premiering the film today and at IDFA, and the European premieres today. And we're kind of, working our way through as we can while theaters are closed. But I'm really excited that the film will be airing on public television in the US next year on the incredible POV, which Opal knows well, and for their 2021 season. And it's going to be available for free across the United States. And like I mentioned, we're also making plans to take the film to Puerto Rico and do some very carefully curated community screenings and take the film to the communities that participated in the film and really make sure that the film can circulate there. So yeah, we have a lot of plans for 2021, but this is really our last big US based festival
Oh,
in this year. I mean, so for
okay.
people who want to see the film, I just really want to stress that, we have that encore. We're part of the encore presentation.
Yes, good.
So
That's
people have 10 more days to see the film.
they should make time to do so. We went a little bit over, but we were so glad to have the audience engagement, and I just want to give thanks to Naomi Klein and Cecilia Aldarondo for joining us to discuss Cecilia's beautiful Landfall, beautiful and powerful. We have a couple more Facebook Lives today taking place at 2 and then 3 o'clock, so please join us for those. And please come back and join us for more of the Encore films. For now, I'm signing off. Good to see you all. Bye-bye.
Thank you.